I'm delighted to be here, and especially delighted to introduce our speaker, because I've known him for 30 years. It's a sad commentary, but I have literally known him for 30 years. Sam W. Haynes is a professor of history, and he's the director of the Center for Greater Southwestern Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. He received a BA from Columbia University, his MA and PhD at the University of Houston, and that's where he and I met. He's the author of several books. His dissertation was entitled Soldiers of Misfortune, about the Somerville and Mears campaigns in Texas border areas during the beginning of the Mexican War. He then wrote a nifty little book on James K. Polk, which I have used in my class successfully several times. It goes over very well, and of course Polk, we have strong attachments to at this institution. He wrote a book called Unfinished Revolution on attitudes towards the British in the 19th century, American attitudes, that is, and currently he's working on a book on early Texas. The title I was teasing him about the title of his talk. It's Unbecoming Southern. He said it's a blend of a few friends' different publications, but once I saw Texas, I thought it should be Unbecoming Southerners. He didn't think it was that funny. Anyway, here for our Hutchins lecture, I'm proud to introduce Sam Haynes, Unbecoming Southern, the Roots of Texas Exceptionalism. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Put this here. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kenneth. Thanks, Patrick. I'd also like to thank the Hutchins family. Okay, just getting my bearings here. Got it. Okay. So I'm, as Joe indicated, I'm not a Southern historian, but I teach about a state and I write about a state that has a lot of Southerners in it, which I guess is one of the reasons why Texas is so very odd. But I'm going to start off by talking about somebody who you may know, you may recognize this photo. It's a small group, but let me just ask you, do you know who this is? I figured everybody would know. It's not like it's a surprise. So here's someone who grew up in Central Texas. He was the son of a cotton farmer. His grandfather was also a cotton farmer. He marries into the East Texas cotton aristocracy in 1934. He will marry a woman who is born and raised on a 15,000 acre plantation in East Texas, in a house that the bricks were hand-baked by slaves. That, of course, is Lady Bird Johnson. Now, the reason I want to start with LBJ for this talk is just simply to say that he starts off as a Southerner, and by, of course, the end of his career, or by the time he's president of the United States, he's become this avatar for all things Texan. He's as emblematic of a Texas identity as, say, Big Tex, who is the enormous 55-foot figure that looms over the state fair and greets visitors every fall. LBJ once brags to a reporter that his great-grandfather had died at the Alamo, and a quick fact check revealed this to be false, and much to his annoyance. His response was that he'd gotten the battle wrong. It was the Battle of San Jacinto. This also proved to be false. And in fact, Johnson had ancestors who had distinguished themselves in the Civil War. But that wasn't the connection that he wanted to claim. What he wanted to claim was the Texas Revolution. He was quite annoyed that he couldn't. And as we all know, Johnson taxed to the center on civil rights in the 1950s. His rhetoric as president, his foreign policy rhetoric, is larded with folksy frontier metaphors. We're going to nail the coonskin to the wall in Vietnam, what some people have referred to as his Alamo complex. It's just hard to get a handle on Johnson. I mean, every biographer who's worked on him, Robert Dallek, Robert Cairo, they've really tried to come to grips with Johnson's identity. Was he a Southerner with roots in the region's cotton culture? Was he a Texan with roots in its Western ranching culture? Nobody really seems to know. So I mentioned Johnson because I don't think he's unusual. I think Johnson is like many Anglo-Texans in the first half of the 20th century. They shed their Southern heritage quite easily, and they fashioned for themselves a Western persona. Now, Johnson had the financial resources to make good the part, I suppose. He buys a ranch on the banks of the Pedernales River after he leaves the White House. Those who couldn't were able to dress the part. But the Texas identity, of course, is more than just a fashion statement of cowboy boots and 10-gallon Stetson hats. It's a jumble of historical cliches as much as sartorial ones. A triumphalist narrative in which the Texas Revolution and the Texas Republic feature prominently, where hardy pioneers subdued a harsh environment and where the Anglo alpha male roamed free. It laid claim to an artificial brand of exceptionalism, constructing an elaborate and ennobling mythology around the exploits of Anglo-Texans in their conflicts against Mexicans and Native Americans. Now, this chest-thumping regional chauvinism has really rankled Texas historians and confounded them and exasperated them, given the state's southern antecedents. After all, the region is populated largely by Southerners during the 19th century. It rebels against Mexico primarily over states' rights issues and slavery. During the Republic period, it becomes a beachhead of the peculiar institution in the West. African Americans, for a time, are the fastest growing population group in Texas between 1846 and the Civil War. They are the fastest growing ethnic group. And the economic dominance of the cotton culture can be seen in the state's path toward disunion. If you're familiar with the Texas Ordinance of Secession, it's among the most explicit in its defense of slavery. By the time you get to 1900, 25 to 30% of the nation's cotton is grown in Texas. So you get the general idea. I could go on. And there's no doubt that East Texas shares and continues to share with the Lower South many of the same cultural chromosomes. But this debate generally hinges upon how southern the state remained as its population moved farther west after the Civil War. And as the cotton economy came to rely increasingly on Mexican labor as it expanded into the Blackland Prairie. And that's in the late 19th century. To be sure, some degree of hybridization occurs. I don't think there's any question about that. But even if the Central Texas represents some sort of ethno-racial middle ground, it really seems unlikely that was able to forge a distinctive identity for the state as a whole. So, some historians have argued, Texas historians, that the bitter experience of Civil War prompts Texans to downplay their southern roots. In an effort to disassociate the state from the trauma of the lost cause, they tailored their historical memory to give greater emphasis to the state's frontier heritage. This is an interpretation that most Texas historians are aware of and I think agree with. But the fact is that white male Texans seemed perfectly comfortable with their identity as sons of the Old South for about 50 years after the Civil War. It's only after World War I that you begin to see what you might refer to as a regional popular culture emerge. And once that's set in motion, once this decoupling process is set in motion, then it happens very, very quickly. Indeed, you really can't help but be struck by the speed and the eagerness with which Anglo-Texans jettison their southernness and embrace a Texas exceptionalist myth. So I think it's important then to focus on some of the specific conditions that made this transformation possible. And what I'd like to do is sort of give you an overview of that process today. Okay. There are times when I don't have any images, and so I'm just going to leave it blank like that. Let me just start with a caveat of sorts. We spend a lot of time as historians talking about identity. We have a lot of stock invested in terms like that because these are terms that are supposed to get at who we are as individuals and as groups. But in fact, identity is often aspirational. It often refers to what we want to be. And I think the Texas experience reminds us that identity can sometimes be ephemeral, superficial, and therefore easily discarded for something else. So let me place this in a larger national context and go back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Texas is part of a nostalgia boom that we see across the country during this period. Popular memory is used to develop or refine many regional identities. You see this in California, you see this in New Mexico, see it in the antebellum South, you see it in the Midwest as well. It's all part of this larger national trend. And it's generally considered conventional wisdom that this fascination with the past in the late 19th century, like public memory generally, was notoriously selective, involved some degree of outright invention, and was created primarily by elites. And I don't think Texas is any different in that regard. It's also widely assumed that this heritage mania was a reaction to the pressures of modernity and stemmed from an intense desire to recapture an idealized past. And so it's here where I think Texas is different. The frontier ethos that became inextricably linked to the myth of Texas exceptionalism really didn't have much to do with heritage, or for that matter, a sense of place. This phase of the state's development was so short-lived and left so few traces of it behind that it existed more as an organizing framework with which to approach contemporary challenges. Less dependent on tradition and regional identities, the Texas exceptionalist myth that emerges in the 20th century was never static, but it's in a constant state of evolution, as I'm going to try to explain today. It served to facilitate the relentless pursuit of self-invention, self-fashioning, and reinvention for those who subscribe to it. Now, in its earliest phases, the process by which the Texas creation story becomes etched in the state's public consciousness follows a pretty familiar pattern. Progressive club women, and in this case, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the DRT, would take the lead in crafting an historical narrative that highlighted the early years of Anglo settlement. The organization had grown out of a desire to tend to the grave sites of Texas revolutionary heroes. This was a traditionally domestic task for women, and it was used as an entree to gain entrance, or to expand their influence in the public sphere. Within a few years, the group was devoting much of its energies to education. The state legislature agreed to make Texas history a required course in all public schools. That's still true today at the 7th grade level. The DRT is involved in renaming literally hundreds of schools after Texas revolutionary heroes. And finally, in the group's most public role, it saves the Alamo from demolition. As you see here, it's in rather sorry shape in the 1890s, and it turns the San Jacinto battlefield into a park. Now, although historical preservation and commemoration was, in those days, a decidedly female activity, this is true for the DRT and the UDC and so on, the Daughters did seek out male sanction, as they did during their annual meetings, when an outside speaker was invited to address the group. In the organization's early years, the Texas Veterans Association was called upon, an officer in that organization was called upon, to thank the DRT for their work on behalf of historical preservation of the state. And as their ranks dwindled, as the veterans' ranks dwindled, then this task was given to a political leader or a business leader in the community. And I think these events really do bring out in bold relief the gendered constructions of remembrance. Because in their own remarks, the DRT leaders wrap the familiar story of the Anglo struggle for independence, and for them it really was exclusively an Anglo story. Wrap that in the rituals of public mourning and the sentiments of bereavement. Anglo-Texan leaders who were called upon in the 1830s, who called upon colonists in the 1830s to sacrifice their lives, people like Benjamin Milam, who we've now forgotten about, William Barrett Travis. These are the people who are really in the DRT's pantheon of heroes. Similarly, I think in the case of the San Jacinto battlefield, do I have a picture here? Yeah, I do. The local DRT chapter is interested in paying tribute to the 9 Texans killed in the battle, and they erect this monument, I think, in 1896. Now, in the Texas veterans, however, or the political or business leaders who are called upon to speak to the groups, usually, or invariably, I would say, frame the Texas Revolution in much more hegemonic terms. They choose to highlight martial achievement, both individual and national. They invariably cast the struggle as a victory for Anglo-Saxon institutions, and they tend to exaggerate or tend to wax extravagant. Anyway, there are efforts to evaluate the revolution. At San Jacinto, at this ceremony, for example, and there's a rededication ceremony every year on April 21st, it's argued by these male speakers that since the revolution leads to the Mexican War 10 years later, which enlarges the national domain by about a third, the Battle of San Jacinto must be regarded as one of the most decisive in history. Well, there can be no doubt that the DRT endorses those sentiments, but they remain focused on sacralizing the process of historical commemoration. In San Antonio in 1908, and you may know this already, the organization becomes embroiled in a very public debate over the preservation of the Alamo. And the splinter group that prevails, headed by Clara Driscoll, actually cared surprisingly little about restoring the site to its original condition. Okay? It looked nothing like this in 1836. It was just 4 walls. The roof had caved in. The campanulate, or as we say in Texas, the hump, because we don't know what a campanulate is, it was just simply 4 walls. And Clara Driscoll's not really interested in restoring it to its original condition. There were some in the DRT who were, and that's why there's this debate. But for Clara Driscoll, this is the shrine of Texas liberty. And it really does for her and for other DRT members. I think it embodies and essentializes what they think is the Texas Revolution's true meaning. After Clara Driscoll wins this fight, the DRT holds annually something known as the pilgrimage, where they will march from downtown San Antonio to the mission. It's a candlelight service. It's called the Light of Loving Remembrance. And so for the DRT, this is an iconic symbol of the Texas Revolution, but it's also something more, I think. It's a symbol of the self-abnegation and self-denial that was so much a part of the Victorian moral worldview. So if the daughters' reverent piety clouded their commitment to an accurate rendering of the past, the state's tourism industry, which would assume an increasingly active role in shaping public memory after World War I, would evince an even more cavalier approach to the historical record. Tourism is no longer an elite pastime by the early 20th century. It becomes a ritual of citizenship for Americans, the result of a combined effort on the part of civic boosters, the railroad industry, the automobile industry, through media campaigns, and travel guidebooks, such as the enormously popular See America First series. This iconographic shorthand begins to emerge by which Americans know their country through its landmarks and its landforms. Some of the West's more exotic locales are now promoted relentlessly as a refuge and a sanctuary from the frenetic tempo of urban life. Now, this poses a problem for Texas because just what exactly does it have to promote? The sprawling state is too big to be identified with a geographical feature, while heritage tourism required a unique built environment. California Spanish missions, New Mexico pueblos, those provided visitors with a visual confirmation of an imagined past. With the exception of the Alamo, it had no landmarks to reify the master narrative the daughters had worked so hard to create. So this could have been a fatal liability for the state, as a tourist destination anyway. But ironically, it allows Anglo-Texans to craft a creation myth that is oddly detached from the constraints of the past. So their heritage becomes this pastiche of familiar archetypes. Rugged pioneers, a ragtag band of Texian rebels fighting the Mexican army, cowboys on the open range. In 1923, a New York newspaperman speaks to a group of advertising executives in Corsicana, Texas. His name is Theodore Price. Oops, I'm sorry, I forgot the Claire-Driscoll painting. And Theodore Price speaks to them on, here's his topic. It's what does Texas have to advertise and how to advertise it. That's the name of his talk. And so Price says that Texans have really failed to develop the state's greatest resource, which he refers to as your gloriously romantic history. It was clear, though, that Price was interested less in a Texas past than in the state's potential as a site of national conciliation, as we see here. A rendezvous where the West and East, the North and the South would meet, and sectional prejudice and antagonism would be dissolved. So more than a decade would pass before Texans found the opportunity to act on Price's suggestion. But in the early 1930s, momentum begins to build for a celebration to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Texas independence from Mexico. Recognizing the need to promote the state and attract tourism, the legislature pledges $3 million for centennial-related events. The federal government weighs in with another $3 million. The Works Progress Administration will oversee an extensive construction program to memorialize the Texas Revolution and the history of the state more broadly. And during this period, it constructs 20 statues, a dozen museums, the restoration or reconstruction of historic forts, and the placing of literally hundreds and hundreds of historical markers across the state, which are still visible today. So from the fall of 35 to the fall of 36, more than 250 towns and cities in Texas stage centennial observances. Centennial organizers launch a massive publicity campaign to make Texas a tourist destination. Trainloads and busloads of goodwill ambassadors are dispatched across the country to spread word of the centennial, to gain the maximum national exposure in the press. Texas Centennial Commission reminds citizens of the great numbers of visitors to the state and how they must take part in community beautification projects, to view the promotion of the celebration as a civic duty. Even school children are involved. In this publicity campaign, 500,000 postcards are penned by school children and sent to relatives outside of Texas, urging them to come to Texas for their vacation. It's really difficult to overstate the magnitude of this campaign to rebrand the state of Texas in 1936. I would argue that such an effort could only have been undertaken during the New Deal, for it involved the marshaling of human resources by federal, state, county, and municipal bureaucracies on an unprecedented scale. A vast interlocking network of commissions and committees a partnership of the public and private sector, all working collectively to craft a new image for the state. And that image was the rugged individualism of the American frontier. So it's somewhat ironic, by the way. If you go to Texas and if you see these landmarks, you will always see a legend like this, something like it, acknowledging the support of the federal government. Now, you may already know that the iconography of the Texas Revolution, not just the monuments, but the, say the come and take it flag at the Battle of Gonzales, these have all been sort of appropriated by libertarian organizations. And very often they are unaware of the role that the federal government has played in crafting this narrative in the 20th century. It's ironic, that's all I'm saying. Actually, wait, so I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm sorry. Okay. As Texas prepares to celebrate the centennial, most committees turn, as they had always done, to women's clubs such as the DRT, the faithful custodians of public memory, to organize historical pageants and parades. And I don't have any photos of this. I looked very hard. They are reproduced in newspapers, but not. I couldn't get anything that would show up on a PowerPoint. The DRT is involved in ceremonies in San Antonio and in Houston. San Antonio at the Alamo, and Houston, well, just outside of Houston, the San Jacinto battlefield. And the DRT deviates from its commemorative script only in scale. Clara Driscoll's still around in the 1930s. She organizes the events in San Antonio. And she had always seen, as I sort of indicated before, seen the Alamo Chapel as a symbol of, as an ecumenical symbol, and as a symbol of national reconciliation. So she stages this extraordinary event in Alamo Plaza, where the Archbishop of San Antonio delivers a high mass. He's surrounded on the dais by nuns and priests and novices. And there are about 20,000 people who attend the ceremony. After the high mass has been celebrated, it's followed by, she had this gift for theatrics. She brings on the United Daughters of the Confederacy, then the Daughters of Union Veterans, the Daughters of the American Revolution are involved. There are Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, one after the other. It goes on for several hours. In San Jacinto, the battlefield there, the consecration ceremony is repeated, but on an even larger scale. A gigantic baldachin is erected over the battlefield. 26 archbishops are invited to speak to a crowd of about 75,000. It was supposed to be larger, but it rained. NBC broadcasts the service to the nation. You have about 2,000 school children who form the Texas flag, and they are choreographed. The Texas flag morphs into a picture of the Stars and Stripes. So that's the DRT's contribution to the 1936 centennial. But in other cities, and I'm going to focus on the area that I'm from, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you see a very, very different representation. Elsewhere, the DRT's role as guardians of the past is really undermined by business leaders who saw the centennial as an opportunity to promote the state, not to commemorate the past. And the centerpiece of the centennial program is the World's Fair in Dallas. They beat out Houston and San Antonio. They had by far the highest bid. And business leaders in Dallas were hoping to replicate the success of the Chicago World's Fair in 33-34, which had been an enormous success. The Chicago Fair was titled A Century of Progress. It was the theme of the Chicago Fair, but it was adopted by subsequent cities that held fairs in the Depression era, San Diego and then Dallas. And this allows civic boosters to present host cities as models of future prosperity, where visitors, in the words of FDR, could visualize the national life which is to come. Now, the absence of historical landmarks really didn't matter to Dallas, the Dallas business community. It's really more interested in using the fair to brand the city as a mecca of economic progress. So the dilapidated state fairgrounds south of town are transformed into a gleaming, air-conditioned complex of Art Deco buildings. As in previous fairs, a corporate sponsorship is very, very important. General Electric sponsors the Hall of Electricity. General Motors underwrites the Hall of Transportation. They really are determined to show that Dallas is open for business. So exposition organizers don't dwell on the state's independence from Mexico. They opt instead to frame the event as a general celebration of the state's frontier heritage. Eager to appropriate what they saw as the enterprising spirit of the American pioneer, they used this trope to evoke a sense of inexorable forward movement. Souvenir brochures harp relentlessly on this theme, often juxtaposing scenes of Texas in the early days of Anglo settlement with photographs of those same locations in 1936, by which time they had become transformed into bustling urban centers. These are all murals from the Hall of State. Okay? The decline of women as arbiters of the state's history would be seen most clearly in the centennial observances sponsored by Fort Worth, which, like Dallas, would also use the anniversary as an opportunity to redefine its image. Now, if you know anything about Fort Worth, then you might know that it had once served very briefly as a stopover for cattle drives after the Civil War. But it really owed its growth to, as a meatpacking center, it was really more like St. Louis and Chicago in that regard. In fact, in the late 19th century, it actually tried to shed its cowtown image, unsuccessfully apparently, and by the 1920s had decided to embrace it. It was now holding an annual stock show, which had become quite popular. And with the romanticization of the American cowboy, the popularity of Tom Mix in the 1920s, singing cowboys like Gene Autry, for example, then they really have, they embrace this image on a permanent basis. Now, Fort Worth's counterfeit cowboy image is personified by this man, Amon Carter, who's quite a character. He was not a cowboy, although he certainly appears to be one here. He grew up in Montague County, which is cotton country. He was a traveling salesman. Then comes to Fort Worth and gets involved in the newspaper business and uses that as a springboard to establish a media empire. He's the owner of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He is responsible for the Fort Worth legend, title, nickname, Where the West Begins. He slaps it on the Fort Worth Star-Telegram masthead. You can still see it there today. He gets the Chamber of Commerce to use it as well. And Carter, although this predates him, the Dallas-Fort Worth rivalry predates Amon Carter. He certainly doesn't do anything to stop it. After Dallas is successful in its bid for the Centennial Exposition, he decides to hold one, or he decides that Fort Worth will hold one of its own to draw attention to the state's putative Western heritage. So this is called, so there are two centennial celebrations in the DFW area in 1936. There's the Central Exposition in Dallas. 30 miles to the west, there is the Frontier Centennial Exposition. Now, in the early planning stages, it appeared to be clear that the city's club women would play a prominent role. Fort Worth's Women's Club enthusiastically embraced the opportunity to provide visitors with an authentic representation, insofar as they understood it, of the city's heritage. And they established a raft of committees to address such issues as historical preservation, historical exhibits, and so on. And the group generates such considerable publicity with its proposal to clothe female greeters at the celebration in period costume. And here's one from the Fort Worth, one of the Fort Worth newspapers. There are several. And there are some members of the Dallas Women's Club who want all Fort Worth residents to dress in period costume during the 3 months of the exposition. That isn't particularly successful. But this generates a sort of a debate which is worth mentioning, because they really weren't sure how accurate or what period costume they should agree on. The debate was, should it be 1836 period costume, but Fort Worth hadn't been built then, and wouldn't be built for many years afterwards, built in the 1840s, about the same time Dallas was. Or should they be true to the period costume of the 1870s, when the city was, or the town was briefly a stopover for cattlemen en route to Kansas. As it turns out, Centennial organizers could care less about this kind of arcane debate. Carter quickly hires a New York promoter of Barnum-esque reputation, Billy Rose. And Rose views the exposition's frontier theme as just a motif, a general motif, a theme, a vehicle around which to frame a New York-style extravaganza. So the result is, much to the horror, I'm sure, of the Dallas Women's Club, a part stock show, part Ziegfeld Follies. Rose promptly reduces the role of the women's division, giving them control over a small historical museum and relegating their efforts to city beautification projects. But that's really the extent of their involvement in the Fort Worth Centennial. And instead, as was the custom for his efforts in New York City, used the exposition to sort of test the boundaries of propriety, certainly Fort Worth standards of propriety, let's put it that way. This is Miss Fort Worth. Billy Rose announced that he was bringing in 150 showgirls from New York City, which he did, and then caused an even greater sensation by bringing in Sally Rand, who had caused quite a sensation at the Chicago Fair. She was a fan dancer. And so on the Midway, on the Fort Worth Midway, was Sally Rand's nude ranch. And notwithstanding protests from religious groups and some women's clubs, the commoditization of female sexuality would become a staple feature for the Fort Worth Centennial under Rose's direction. So with little, if any, clearly, with little or any regard for historical continuity, the Fort Worth Centennial celebration fuses tropes of the frontier, the Old West, and pioneer days to create a themed space without chronological or geographical parameters. The entrance to the Midway is a frontier fort, as you see in the upper left. And as you've walked into the Midway, then you would see a barbershop, an old Western barbershop, hitching posts, a saloon, a dance hall, and so on and so forth. In essence, a generic Old West boomtown. It could have been Virginia City, Nevada. It could have been Tombstone, Arizona. It could have been Abilene, Kansas. Of course, it wasn't Fort Worth. It wasn't any of these places. It resembled nothing so much as the movie set of a B-Western, which visitors would have recognized, would have found familiar, and therefore authentic. In short, then, the centennial celebrations in the state's principal cities reveal that Anglo-Texans did not commemorate the region's independence from Mexico in exactly the same way. Far from it. In Houston and San Antonio, cities that could claim connection to the events of 1836, DRT orchestrated ceremonies remained fixed on the story of the Texas Revolution. But in the newer cities of Dallas and Fort Worth, the centennial took the form of an agglomeration of ambiguously historical images, all of which created a simple backdrop for entertainment venues designed to attract tourist dollars. But each one of these cities seeks to use their celebration as a means to situate Texas in a larger national context, or national narrative, a narrative in which the state's southern roots had no place whatsoever. Thus, the murals in the Dallas Exposition Hall of State and the Fort Worth Coliseum depict a seamless history of westward moving pioneers. The ones for the Hall of State didn't really reproduce, so these are actually from the Colosseum, the exterior of the Colosseum. The importance of cotton as an economic mainstay of the region could be duly noted, but these visual history lessons offer only the briefest allusions to the antebellum era or the Confederacy, and they make no reference to Reconstruction at all. More enduring than the centennial celebrations themselves was the federally sponsored monument building program, which I referred to earlier, which starts in '36, but which is still ongoing by the late '30s. Here's the cenotaph in Alamo Plaza. We tend to think of commemoration and memorialization as words with almost identical meanings, yet in the 1930s, at the height of the Depression, it was the memorial, the edifice itself, that takes, or begins to take, center stage. Unlike the statues erected by women's groups in the Progressive period that adorn cemeteries, city parks, courthouse squares, centennial projects dominate the civic landscape. The sheer size, a self-validating testament to the discourse of Anglo-American conquest. For WPA administrators, bigger was better. They may have occasionally balked at the price of the materials, but they never balked at the size and the scope of the monuments themselves, because this was, of course, the mandate of the WPA. The larger the construction job, the more people it could hire. Nor were these monuments intended as sites of remembrance alone. Some of the more ambitious Depression-era projects were designed as tourist attractions in their own right. As such, they assumed an explicitly educational function, with funding for visitor centers, research libraries, and museums providing a state-sanctioned, seemingly unimpeachable master narrative. The San Jacinto battlefield may serve as an example of the evolving nature of historical commemoration in Texas during this period. By the 1930s, the notion that a few hundred Anglo-Americans and a few dozen Tejanos had achieved a victory over the Mexican army that deserved to be ranked as one of the great victories in modern times, this had actually become conventional wisdom. Not anywhere else, but in Texas it had become conventional wisdom. So it seemed entirely appropriate then when Jesse Jones, who was head of the RFC, suggested it as a memorial, an obelisk which, when finished, would stand 567 feet tall, 15 feet taller than the Washington Monument, and enhanced by a 1,700-long reflecting pool. Now, if you've ever been there, and I was there just recently in preparation for this talk, and had not been in many, many years, and was shocked. It is an engineering marvel. It's on the Houston Ship Channel. It's a very swampy area. And this is an extraordinary engineering achievement. But you can also get a sense, it's right in the middle of the battlefield. It required extensive heavy equipment, earth-moving equipment, which did just unbelievable damage to the site and made archaeological fieldwork absolutely impossible. They were finding musket balls and bayonets miles and miles away because they had carted all of this earth away from the site and they had used it for other construction projects. So, the act of memorialization then becomes really an end in itself, eclipsing the very historical event that it was intended to commemorate. So the obelisk is finished in '39, which is significant, because by that time, the nation's attention has shifted from the Depression to the specter of war in Europe. So the story of the battle, etched into the friezes along the base of the monument, now reflects a new set of concerns. Here's one. You don't have to read the whole thing. I'm going to give you a few others, but I'm actually going to, I have them as text. While the text continued to perpetuate the pretense that the battle ranks as one of the most important in history, it also offers a thinly disguised commentary on contemporary events. Eschewing the racialized discourse that had framed the narrative of the rebellion during the Progressive period, by 1939, the official version of the struggle for independence averred that Anglo colonists had been treated liberally by Mexico, and that relations between the two peoples had been cordial. Only the rise of unscrupulous and despotic leaders, dictators in other words, had made it necessary for the colonists to renounce their loyalties to the Mexican nation state. In another panel, we're told that Santa Anna invaded Texas, which I think is sort of analogous to Washington invading western Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion. And we're also told that immigrant soldiers come to Texas's aid. These were filibusters, by the way. They're not called filibusters in Texas history books, unfortunately. But if you're familiar with William Walker or Narciso Lopez, they are part of the filibustering culture of the early 19th century. They're all called Texians in Texas history books. Somehow the term Texian is vague enough and no one seems to really know what that means. So someone who has just arrived from Georgia is known as a Texian, just as a colonist who had come there with Stephen F. Austin. So once viewed purely as a seminal moment in this story of an ascendant America, the Texas Revolution now seemed to offer a prism through which every conceivable threat to the body politic could be seen. And so in these annual ceremonies that follow, invited speakers at the Alamo, at San Jacinto, each year unfailingly hold up the 1836 rebels as intrepid defenders of freedom, as they inveigh against tyranny of all sorts, fascism, godless communism, big government, you name it. And whatever the threat, a muscular defense of American ideals always seems to lie at the heart of these Jeremiads. Thus, when the U.S. Navy decommissions the battleship Texas in 1948, the state legislature decides to create a permanent home for it about half a mile away. And this is, I talked about the disturbing of the site before. The battleship Texas, the ship channel is dredged. This is where the Texas camp was on the day of the battle on April 21st, 1836. It is now completely destroyed, so that there is this dock for the battleship Texas. So it's no longer a site of remembrance for the 9 Americans who had died there. And I'm going back to the Brigham Monument just to give you a sense of the change in the way this battlefield was seen. This is how the progressive women's clubs wanted to honor the battle. But it now becomes this tribute to American military power in about 50 years. That's how much it's changed. So the post-war period also reveals the extent to which the tropes of Texas exceptionalism become tailored to appeal exclusively to white males. The call to sacrifice issued by William Barrett Travis and Benjamin Milam, who I referred to earlier, that had once resonated so powerfully with the club women of that period, continued to be a part of the revolutionary mythos in the 1950s. But with the onset of the Cold War, this would give way to a cult of hypermasculinity. It's personified initially by Disney's Fess Parker, who you may know, but later in the later part of the decade by Hollywood with Sterling Hayden as Jim Bowie, and more famously, and let's face it, inevitably, John Wayne as Davy Crockett. Just as the developing world needed the United States to protect it from tyrannical regimes, Texas, effeminized and helpless, and populated only by dark-eyed senoritas, turned in its moment of distress to the virile champions of the Anglo-American frontier. At least that was the narrative in both of these films. Now, curiously, and perhaps, curiously, there is a newly politicized Latino middle class in Texas, which does not have a problem with this, and which suggests an amendment to this, a modest amendment to this interpretation. Noting that Mexican Federalists had, in fact, supported the Anglo insurrection of the 1830s, Tejano groups such as LULAC, the GI Forum, seek to claim the triumphalist narrative as their birthright. Prominent Latino figures, I'm thinking of Carlos Castaneda, a very famous historian at the time, John Herrera, president of LULAC. They speak at the San Jacinto Monument, as do other Latino figures, to remind audiences that Mexican Americans deserved a place of honor in the Texas creation story. Now, this effort to reconfigure so hallowed a narrative as the Anglo struggle against Mexico initially meets with tepid enthusiasm, for it challenges the clash of cultures thesis upon which the doctrine of American manifest destiny rests. But over time, it has gradually gained credence, and from scholars and traditionalists alike, because they've seized upon it, I think, as a means to infuse a rather shop-worn narrative with a new relevance in a state that, according to demographers, will have a Latino majority by 2020. But inclusiveness has some drawbacks. It ignores the simple fact that many Mexicans did not support the Texas Revolution, while the vast majority who did surely lived to regret it. And inclusiveness can only go so far, because it ignores the fate of Native Americans and African Americans for whom the revolution meant forced removal and forced labor. Nonetheless, the Texas creation myth endures, seemingly immune to revisionist challenge. This is a textbook from one of the standard textbooks in U.S. history. You may have seen it. In 2003, Pearson releases American Destiny with this cover, which I loved, because apparently the most American thing they could think of to put on a textbook was a picture of a Spanish mission, which became famous in a battle during the early Mexican Republic. When the DRT more than a century ago took up the task of guarding the holy past, as Betty Ballinger, co-founder of the DRT, it frames the story of Anglo settlement as a symbolic, heroic sacrifice. But it remained for subsequent generations, and subsequent generations of men, to be clear, to inscribe and reinscribe that sacrifice with new meaning. As a result, what passed for heritage soon became little more than a template with which to frame contemporary challenges. Characterized by a shape-shifting mutability, Texas exceptionalism has served as a testament to the fact that a usable myth will always have greater currency than a usable past. Thank you very much.